Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition
that's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Will we ever rise? Will we ever rise above the fear? Can we learn to see the need? Can we share humanity? Well, I can see another day come. Broken people, we can be made whole. We can be made whole. We can be made whole. As we lay down our weapons, open up our hearts. Love is breaking us, love remaking us. Will we ever rise? Will we ever rise above the hate? Can we see another way? Forgive as you forgave. Oh, I can see another day come. Broken people, we can be made whole. We can be made whole. We can be made whole. As we lay down our weapons, open up our hearts. Love is breaking us, love remaking us. Broken people, we can be made whole. We can be made whole. We can be made whole. As we lay down our weapons, open up our hearts. Love is breaking us, love remaking us. Come heal now, take away the blindness, so we can see what we are meant to see. We feel the light, devastating darkness. Oh, I can see another day come. I can see another day come. Broken people, can we be made whole? Can we be made whole? Can we be made whole? Broken people, we can be made whole. We can be made whole. We can be made whole. As we lay down our weapons, open up our hearts. Love is breaking us, love remaking us. Will we ever rise? Will we ever rise above? Good morning, Crosspointe. It has been a long week, with all of our patience being demanded as we await election results, while passions run hot and emotions run high. It really is a reminder to all of us that our well-being is tied up together, that our well-being is in each other's hands in a very real sense. And so times like this, normally we appreciate having a church community where normally we could come together into the same room and look each other in the eye, give hugs, and offer words of faith, hope, and love. We can't gather like that right now in this strange year of 2020. But this morning, myself, Tirza, and Jonathan are going to do our best representatively to offer those words of faith, hope, and love in music, in prayers, and in a message. And we hope that you know that you belong, that we're glad that you're here. Whatever it is that you bring into this metaphoric room, it belongs, and you're part of us. This next song is called Human, and I love it. It says that we're bound together and we can be human only together. So whether or not you feel comfortable to sing out loud, depending on where you are, I hope that you'll know that you're a part of this. And we really are glad that you've joined us today. I need a reform. I need a new mind. I need to set my prejudice aside. I need a new soul. I need a heartbreak. I need to see the tragedies abate. We are bound to one another. We can be human only together, only together. I need a reform. I need a new mind. I need to set my prejudice aside. I need a new soul. I need a heartbreak. I need to see the tragedies abate. We are bound to one another. We can be human only together, only together. We are bound to one another. We can be human only together, only together. I need a reform. I need a reform. Let justice flow like a river, like a river. Righteousness like a stream, like a stream. Let justice flow like a river, like a river. Righteousness like a stream, like a stream. Let justice flow like a river, like a river.
Crosspointe, a lot of us associate November with Thanksgiving. And if you are a part of student ministries or children's ministries, the Crosspointe Family Ministry team wants to invite you to join them in their family challenge for November. And they're calling it Shout Out. So even though we can't be with family and friends in a lot of our community right now, we still want to show gratitude. We want to show people that we're thankful for them. So the way that this challenge works is this. Choose a family or a friend to shout out how much you're grateful for them. So take some chalk, go to their driveway, draw or write what you're thankful for about them. Snap a quick picture, send it to kids@crosspointe.org, or you can tag it on social media @CrosspointeKP. Each photo that you send or pose with will enter your family into a drawing to win a prize. So if you need a little bit more of a challenge, you can shout out to somebody in the community, police station, fire station, somebody who lives in assisted living. Crosspointe Family Ministries also wants to give a shout out to you. We're grateful for you, and we know how challenging things can be right now. There's so many things going on. So we are partnering with Marco's Pizza to give each Crosspointe family a free large cheese pizza. And all you have to do is fill out a form and we'll have a pizza waiting for you to pick up. It's just a simple way that we can cheer you on and show how grateful we are to you. So if you need some more information about the shout out challenge, about the pizza, all those things, you can find the form and more information at our website at crosspointe.org/shoutout. I also want to say how incredibly blown away and amazed we continue to be at how much we are able to do in our community when we partner together, when we pull our resources together, the things that we are able to accomplish together more than we can when we're individuals. So if you would like to partner with us, one way that we do that is financially. And you can partner financially by going to crosspointe.org/contribute, or you can text crosspointenc at 77977. We are so grateful for you, Crosspointe. Lastly, we know that things might feel really, really crazy right now. Everybody has different stories. Things are changing. There's so many things going on in our lives. But we are a community of faith. And so this morning, we want to take a few minutes to just corporately be still, to listen, to pray together. And I want to invite you to do that with me now. Holy God, good God. The unknown is a frightening place to be, and so much is unknown. It feels deep and grave and cold, and it is at the same time both confining and vast. Maybe it's the lack of control that terrifies us, the loss of anything to grasp onto and to ground us. Things are no longer as they were. Maybe it's feelings of shame at the mess we've gotten ourselves into and don't know if we will ever be able to put right again. Not sure if we will ever feel right again. In the unknown, we hear unnerving whispers from voices we don't recognize, or worse, from voices we do recognize. Is it a fear for our safety? Fear for those we love? Fear of loss? Perhaps. Or maybe it's fear that you've forgotten us, abandoned us, finally left us alone. It's understandable to our human minds if you have. It's likely what we would have done. It is perhaps the underlying fear that you, God, are not actually in as much control as we so confidently claim you are. Our confidence is faltering, and now we've spoken that fear out loud too. Loving, listening, hearing God, the unknown is a lonely place. But the psalmist reminds us, where can we go from your spirit? Where can we flee from your presence? If we go to the heavens, you're there. If we go to the deepest depths of body and spirit, if we find ourselves in the darkest of places, in the depths of the unknown, even there You find us. You are with us. For you never really left us. The darkness is light to you. Our fear does not frighten you. Our anger and helplessness do not deter you. Your arms are still a promise of resting place, a lighthouse above the rocks. Remind us, Mother God, that you have not walked away. Remind us, Father God, that all is not lost. Remind us, Eternal God, that you are God of the past, present, and future. The unknown is known to you. Help our unbelief. Fan in us the flame of remembrance. Remind us of who we are and have not ceased to be, even when we find ourselves in the unknown. Remind us that, regardless of the whispers of doubt, your message has not changed. Remind us that the fight for justice and equality is still just as important as it ever was. Remind us what it means to be followers of you, of how vast and deep and perfectly you love the poor, the hurting, the rich, the sick, the ugly, and the beautiful of spirit. Make us planters of the seeds of that love. In our exhaustion, give us the strength to move forward. In our doubt, remind us we are not alone. In our loneliness, remind us to reach out. In our fear, give us courage. Give us strength to continue following you forward, even in the unknown. For you are a good, good God. That much we know. Amen.
Hey, good morning, Crosspointe family. What a week we've had. What a year. What a past 5 years. And I know many of us who call Crosspointe family are carrying a wide range of different emotions right now after a very intense week. There's exhaustion, there's joy, there's disappointment, there's anger, there's hope, there's hopelessness, there's sadness, there's anticipation, there's fear, there's a exhale, and yet also this continued collective holding of our breath. And the reality is many of us probably find ourselves holding several of those different emotions and feelings at the same time, and we really don't know how to even articulate what we're feeling because it's simply a flood of so many different experiences and feelings and things right now. And I've wrestled with for a while what our specific church community needed to hear after this particular week. And so I intentionally held off trying to put together any thoughts till the very last minute because with all the ambiguity, I just wanted to sit in that this week. And I wanted to listen and I wanted to try my best to speak to where we specifically find ourselves as a church community in this moment. And so to help us do that, I want to try to stand on the shoulders of what the story that Steve shared last week about the Israelites. The story of the Israelites thousands of years ago when they were first trying to establish their own tribal and national identity. So for about 430 years, the Israelites, the Hebrew people, they were enslaved in Egypt. And then we come to this ancient story of the Exodus, where God uses a man named Moses to help free the Hebrew people from the bonds of slavery that they had experienced under Pharaoh. And so you have that epic moment, right? Some of you remember that, where Moses demands of Pharaoh, "Let my people go." And then finally, Pharaoh relents and he lets them go. But then he changes his mind and he sends his army after them. And the Israelites find themselves stuck between the sea and Pharaoh's army as they're chasing after them. And it seems like certain death for them. But then the waters of the sea miraculously part and the Israelites are able to walk through to the other side. And then as they get to the other side, Pharaoh's army starts to chase after them. And then the water that had parted collapses back down on top of Pharaoh's army. And the Israelites are suddenly free. That God has liberated them from their oppression and slavery. And this Exodus story has been the foundational and anchor story for the Hebrew people ever since. And so after their liberation from slavery, God makes it clear to the Israelites that God's vision for Israel is that they would be a new kind of people in the world, a new kind of tribe, a new kind of nation. One that didn't only exist for its own success and survival, but instead would exist to also bring grace and goodness to all the other tribes and nations of the world. That they wouldn't be driven by greed and violence and dominance like every other tribe and nation at the world at the time, where life basically centered around how do we protect ourselves and how do we exercise our dominance on anyone around us, because we'll just consider all of them threats. But rather, they would exist to be a blessing to others, or as Jesus would put it later on, a light to the world, a city on a hill that couldn't be hidden. And so to help them establish a new way of ordering themselves in the world, God gives his people what we now know as the 10 Commandments. And at the foundation of their identity would be this covenant relationship with God. A God who is for them, who is leading them toward life and leading them toward bringing goodness to others. But as the story goes, these newly liberated Israelites, they find themselves in some rather unknown territory. Entire generations of people had no idea what it was like to not be enslaved, to not be slaves in Egypt. So they're in this desert, wilderness, wandering around, following this mystic leading from God as to where they're supposed to settle. And the bottom line was, this unknown, it was really hard. Really hard. So much so that eventually we see the Israelites starting to complain, and they complain to Moses where they say, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader. Let's choose another leader and let's go back to Egypt. So again, here's a people who have been in slavery for over 400 years. They've been liberated and set free from slavery, and the ambiguity and the unknown that they find themselves in is hard. And so they go, you know what? Why don't we just go back to being slaves in Egypt? I mean, sure, there's some downsides to that. Yeah, sure, there's some cost. But at least there's some security, right? I mean, at least there's some meals we can count on. At least there's some stability. You see, whenever things get really hard, many times the typical human reflex is just to revert back to what was, to go back to what's known, to go back to Egypt. And the scriptures tell us that the Israelites all grumbled and complained and wanted to go back. And we don't know if any of them actually did or not. I imagine some of them probably did. But the Hebrew people as a whole, they kept moving forward in faith, trusting that even though they didn't know where God was leading them, that God was leading them somewhere good. And then eventually, after 40 years of wandering in the desert, the Hebrews come to what was known as the Promised Land, referred to as the Promised Land, the land where they were going to settle as a people and as a nation, as a tribe. And they're about to enter into this land, and God tells them, okay, listen, don't forget where you came from. Don't forget your story. That you were a people that were enslaved and that God freed you and liberated you. Don't forget the vision of light that God's called you to be in the world. Don't forget and find yourself adopting the same ways of dominance and oppression and the same power structures just like everyone else and all these other groups and nations and peoples. So the Israelites, they get settled in the new land and they start trying to figure out what it looks like to live in this covenant relationship with God. And what it looks like to live with these 10 commandments that sort of served as relationship vows between God and the Israelites. And yet, as concrete and straightforward as the 10 commandments sound, when you think about it, there's a lot of room for interpretation there. I mean, for example, just think about it. Don't use the name of the Lord your God in vain. Okay? Well, what does that mean? Does it mean don't say, God, that hurt, when you stub your toe? Is that what it means? Or does it mean more like the original Hebrew language implies, where it's much more of a sense of, hey, don't attach God's name and reputation to things that don't actually align with God's heart? In a similar way, where we find people today using the word Christian as an adjective on all sorts of things that don't necessarily align with Christ's heart. But then let's say it is that. It is kind of what the original Hebrew implies. Well, who determines that? And what are the metrics that determine if God's name and reputation wrongly get attached to something in vain? And then just think about other commandments. Take honor your father and mother, or keep the Sabbath holy. I mean, if we sat around and teased those out, we'd probably come up with hundreds of questions that we could debate about in terms of what each of those actually do and don't look like lived out in community with one another. And that ambiguity was really hard. Really hard. And so what you see in some of the other early books of the Hebrew Scriptures are people trying to put definition to and trying to create all sorts of rules and rituals on how do we live these out. But eventually the Israelites were like, this is just messy. Really messy. And so they come to the prophet Samuel and they say, we don't think this can work. Just give us a king who will tell us what to do. I mean, this is the way it's worked for other tribes and other nations, so let's just go follow their roadmap. And Samuel's like, listen, you don't want to do that. You don't want to throw in the towel. You don't want to give up on this vision that God has given us. A king will take us down a path that we don't want to go. If you just want to go back and be like all the other nations and go back to slavery, that's where we're headed. But then we read this in 1 Samuel 8. Verse 19, it says, but the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Just give us a king so we can be like all the other nations. Because again, when things get hard, many times our instinct is to revert back to what's already known, to go back to the ways of Egypt. And so because God is a respecter of free will, God says, okay. I mean, I've tried to warn you, but go ahead. Adopt a king. Appoint a king over yourselves. And shortly afterwards, you start to find kings of Israel slowly adopting all sorts of ways of other empires and using power in ways that God had warned them to avoid. Again, Steve walked us through a bunch of these specifics last week, and if you missed that, I'd highly encourage you to go back and check that out. But then a few kings down the line, we find a king deciding to build a temple in honor of this God who liberated their very own Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt. The same God who invited them into a new kind of story to be a blessing to all people. And yet there's this one sentence in the story that can be easily overlooked. One we find in the book of 1 Kings chapter 5. I want you to notice what it says. King Solomon drafted forced labor out of all Israel, and the draft numbered 30,000 men. Now, I'm not sure about you, but forced labor sure sounds a whole lot like slave labor. That just a handful of decades later, we find the king of Israel enslaving his own people to build a temple for the God who liberated the Hebrews previously from slavery in Egypt. The same God who said, don't forget your own story. Take the grace that's been given to you and give it to others. But you see, when things get hard, it's very easy just to revert back to the same old power structures, same ways of dominance and oppression and greed. Because often what's known is just preferred to what's unknown. It just is. And friends, so here's the thing. The story we're a part of, the faith tradition that we're a part of, is one where God is always inviting us forward. And what's forward is almost always unknown. And that has ramifications for us in terms of how we live out our faith and how we live out our politics, which are in fact not two separate things. So many of us have been told our whole life to keep those things separate. And yet one of the simplest definitions I've heard of politics lately is from Richard Rohr, where he says that politics are how we structure our relationships with one another. And I love the simplicity of that. And when we think about it that way, obviously then how we live out our faith and how we live out our politics have to be intertwined. Because how we relate to others is at the core of both of those. And I believe the way that God is calling us forward is for that not to be defined by partisan lines that demonize the other and always assume the worst of the other. Frankly, that's going back to a way we all know doesn't work. We all know that. We know it's a way that only brings death, that's only reverting us back to Egypt. It's why many of us have wanted to disassociate from the stereotyped assumptions of what it means for many people to be a person of faith and also engaged in politics. And the thing is, we may not understand what it looks like to move forward. We might not know all the details of what it looks like to live out a faith in a politic that isn't trying to demonize the other because we haven't seen it modeled for us. Because we're in such a heavily partisan, divided nation right now. And let's be honest, there's no roadmap for what that actually looks like to live out. There's just not. But I am convinced that the way forward isn't just avoiding the conversation and staying silent. And so as we move forward as a church community in these uncertain days, what I want to do with the rest of our time together is I just want to offer us a few signposts to guide us along the road ahead. And I believe that all these signposts, they have implications for us personally, politically, and how we live out our faith. And I'm not going to detail all of those ways out, but I'm going to trust that we're going to be able to figure out and have great conversations and great reflections around how all these signposts affect us personally, how they affect us collectively in our politics, and how they also affect us as a community of faith. So 1, let's be people that listen. Now it sounds simple, I get it. But friends, we've got to be people that listen. We have to listen to how and why people are hurting, why people are scared. We have to intentionally listen to voices of the vulnerable and the marginalized in our culture. To those affected by systematic injustice, we have to listen to people of color, to our LGBTQIA+ siblings. We have to listen to those in poverty. And to Crosspointe, specifically people here in Cary, North Carolina, even though I know there's Crosspointe people now kind of around the world in different places, but to Cary, North Carolina, as people immersed in one of the highest technological suburban centers of the world, we also have to listen to the millions of people in rural America who are hurting and scared right now. We have to. Now, with that said, I want to be really clear about something. If people are scared simply because they're losing grasp on their ability to exercise dominance or superiority over someone else, if they're scared because the benefits of white supremacy and patriarchy are being systematically threatened, it's still important for us to listen well, to understand if that's what's actually going on. But understand, if that's the case, then it needs to get exposed for what it is. And it needs to be dismantled. And the reality is that's always scary, but it's necessary. It's necessary to move forward in any sort of just and loving way. But I also think that there are millions of other people who are unfairly, at times, get lumped into that same group that are hurting and scared, and they feel unheard, and they need to be listened to. They too need empathy and compassion. They want to link arms to solve similar problems in our world, but everyone just keeps demonizing one another, screaming on top of one another. And we've seen that all week long. We've seen that over the last several years, and no one's ever actually listening to one another. And so, friends, as we move forward into the unknown, I'm convinced that one of the signposts we have to pay attention to is we have to be people who get better at listening. Second signpost I want to offer you is let's be people that hold the leaders we individually voted for accountable for their words and actions. Now, here's the thing. We don't have any problem in our culture today trying to hold the leaders we didn't vote for accountable, trying to hold them responsible for their words and actions. I mean, that's easy to do. And it gets reflected in all sorts of different ways where people are pointing fingers and blaming and mocking and shaming, holding others' feet to the fire when we see them as the enemy. And frankly, that's easy. That is low-hanging fruit, and it happens all the time and doesn't make much difference at all. And to be really clear, I'm not saying don't ever bother trying to hold someone on another team responsible or accountable. Of course we should do that. I just think there are much healthier ways than others to go about it. But of course we should hold them accountable. That's what a healthy system of checks and balances looks like. But again, that's not the point here. The point here is that we already do that. And we have entire organizations and media engines that constantly run that do that freely and often. We have that way of Egypt down pat. But rather, I think one of the important signposts for the way forward is for us to be willing to hold the leaders that we support, the leaders that we voted for, accountable for their words and actions. That you can choose to vote for them, you can choose to support their policies and their platform, but we have to be willing to hold them accountable to basic values like integrity and honesty and the humane and equitable treatment of all people. So for instance, let's just take the last two presidential administrations. When the Trump administration verifiably lies or mocks people, we need supporters of that administration and policy to say, no, that's crossed the line, that's wrong. Or when the Obama administration knowingly continued to supply weapons to another country that was using them for genocide against innocent civilians, we need supporters of that administration to say, no, that's unacceptable, that's wrong. Again, I'm not talking about arguing over different policies and strategies. I'm talking about people committed to the way of Jesus being willing to hold our preferred candidates and leaders and that support the platforms that we believe in to basic values of integrity, honesty, and the humane and equitable treatment of all people. And listen, I'm not talking to the whole nation right now. I don't have that kind of platform. But I am talking to you. I'm talking to Crosspointe, people who at least have some interest in the way of Christ and the way of love. And if we want to have any integrity and credibility at all to speak to other matters in our world, we have to be willing to hold our preferred teams accountable to the most basic of values. Otherwise, our silence will only fuel destructive behavior that will take us backwards toward the ways of Egypt once again. Now, here's a third signpost for the way as we move forward together. Let's be willing to constantly remind ourselves, of course, this is hard. Of course, it's exhausting. Of course, it's maddening. Of course, it's filled with struggle and hardship. Of course it is. Probably about 4 to 5 years ago, I was sitting with members of our elder board here at Crosspointe, and I was just venting about how hard and exhausting it was trying to fund and build a YMCA. It was something we had never seen a church community do before. There was no one to show us the way. There was no one to say, here's the mistakes to avoid, here's the things you should do or shouldn't do. And I was in the middle of it and just spent and exhausted. And I'll never forget that moment when one of them looked at me very calmly and just said, Jonathan, of course it's hard. This is what we signed up for. To do something that we felt led by God to do that hasn't been done before. And Jonathan, you're the leader. This is going to be hard. Why would we expect it to be any different? And And something significant shifted in me that day. And I started to realize, why was I shocked that this is the way that it is? That the way forward into the unknown, into a new future, was filled with all sorts of struggle and difficulty. I mean, of course it was. Did I expect that it just was going to be easy? Some comfortable road? Of course it was hard. This last week, I wrote a piece on social media that I shared via our e-newsletter here at Crosspointe earlier in the week as well. And in it, it was on election day morning, and I had to run out somewhere. And so I just wrote it up and hit send on it and closed my laptop and left. And what I was trying to do was simply broaden awareness of different people's feelings about election day and inviting us to have more empathy and compassion to others. And it ended up gaining a fair amount of traction and attention on Facebook. But with that, as many of you know, comes both encouragement and criticism. And so at one point, someone commented something like, "Well, I can see why attendance dropped at your church." And yeah, I don't always engage in the comment sections of social media. I tend to try to avoid that a lot of time. But I just decided this was one of those moments that I'm going to lean into and just address it head on. If you're going to say that publicly, I'm going to write back publicly. And so here's what I wrote back. Yes, membership dropped at Crosspointe significantly a few years ago. And I've spoken clearly about and publicly why that happened. When we made it crystal clear that we were completely affirming of our LGBTQIA+ siblings in every way. That we believe that Black lives matter and that white supremacy needs to be rooted out. When we confronted racially charged rhetoric from people in power. That women could and would serve in every area of leadership in our church, and the same for our LGBTQIA+ siblings. And that we're invited to have faith in Christ first and foremost, rather than placing our faith in the Bible or someone's particular interpretation of the Bible. That worship sometimes includes songs of celebration, but also includes hard cries of lament and pain before God. That the word Christian is never an adjective in the Bible. And that the good news that Jesus taught is actually good news for all people, here and now, as well as forever. When we did that, many people left. And while that was incredibly painful, we wish them well and hope they find a church community they can thrive in. But for us, it opened the way for a lot of new people to join with us, and we've never been healthier or more resolved. Grace and peace to you on your own journey. Now, here's why I chose to just share that with all of you. It's something I posted publicly, so I might as well just share it with all of you. Because friends, what we're doing is hard. It's really hard. All those things I just listed out, that's hard. It's confronting religious powers and structures that have been in place a long time, and many of which no longer resemble the ways and teachings of Jesus, a way marked by humility, a willingness to serve, love, and look out for the best interests of all people. And instead, what it ends up often looking like is this fight for control and power and using fear and intimidation and slapping Jesus' name onto it. It's confronting systems of injustice and dehumanization in our culture that spit in the face in the way of love and the dignity of every human being created in the image of God. And so, friends, understand, when you're navigating this world right now and you feel lost at times, and you feel angry and you feel disoriented and you feel like the whole world is upside down, and when it feels like you can't make sense of the way people are acting around you and what people are saying and what they're doing, listen, there are going to be times when, of course, you're going to feel that way. You're not alone. And you're not the first that have felt that way. This is how change always happens. And for millions of us in this world, what's been passed down to us is that the highest goal is to go after safety. That the highest achievement is to go after comfort and security and what's known at all cost. And that we need to protect and defend and stay exactly where we've always been, because what we've been told is that's the tradition and that's what we do. You know what? And that everything we ever needed to know was written down 2,000 years ago in a sacred text, a collection of songs, poems, stories, and history known as the Bible, and that anything new we could possibly learn from science or sociology or psychology or even the Spirit of Christ for our particular time and culture today, in the here and now, well, that's just progressive. That's just dangerous. Friends, what I want us to realize is that's not the faith tradition we're actually a part of. We're part of a faith tradition that's from the very beginning been invited to go forward into the unknown, to keep growing, to keep learning. But here's the thing, when we actually live that out, it will always be seen as a threat to the status quo. It will always seem dangerous to the institutions that are used to being in power, no matter what kind of institution it is. It doesn't matter if that's family, it doesn't matter if it's business, if it's academics, if it's religion. It will always be seen as a threat. And what you and I will discover along the way is that there's this catch-22 that often comes with it. Where as you start moving forward, you may find yourself feeling more awakened and more alive than ever before. You find yourself excited about new possibilities and new potential ways of being and living out love and faith in the world, new ways of inclusion and belonging that you didn't even know was possible. And you find that resonating in your heart, but at the same time, you start finding yourself being labeled as dangerous to the system. Find yourself being called names like heretic and that you've been deceived by some sort of false gospel. And what many of us haven't done is taken the time to sincerely grieve and mourn, because no one told us that this is actually how it works. No one told us that. No one told us that, you know what? If you follow this path forward, a number of people won't move forward with you. And that it will be deeply lonely and isolating at times. And even loved ones will think you're crazy, that you've abandoned the values that you grew up with and they don't even know who you are anymore. But you see, friends, that's why understanding history and understanding the story that we're a part of is so important. We have centered our faith around Jesus of Nazareth, who was executed by the religious and political systems of his day because of the disruption to the system that he was, and because of his challenge to the previously understood and accepted ways of seeing God and treating people. Again, this is our faith tradition. This is the story of the people of faith that we link arms with, those who are willing to move forward into the unknown, because that's where God's Spirit is leading us. And so, of course, it will be hard. Of course it will be. Confronting bias and prejudice in ourselves is hard. Confronting systems of oppression and injustice and bigotry and patriarchy and supremacy, that's hard. Of course it is. Holding our own patterns and words and behaviors up to the mirror of the ways and teachings of Christ, and learning how to be more loving and forgiving and patient and generous to those that are in our own home, to those that are in our own school, to those that are in our own neighborhood, to those who are around the world. Of course that's hard. Advocating for the goodness to all people, to be the light to the whole world that people of our faith tradition have been called to be for thousands of years. Friends, of course that's hard. And moving forward, understand it's going to be really messy at times. And I'm sure as a church, we just need to understand together as we move forward, especially in the midst of a pandemic, and then even after the pandemic, we're going to try a bunch of things as a church community. And I'm just letting you know up front, some of them aren't going to work. They just won't. and we'll go, you know what? We learned some things there. And when it gets harder, it will also be very tempting to just say, you know what? Let's just go back to how it was. I mean, just give us a version we're familiar with. And even if we have to put up with a bunch of stuff we really don't like, just give us what we know. We just want to go back to Egypt. We just want to be like all the other nations. We just want to be like all the other churches. And I get that, because that can be in me as well, because I like things to be easy. I like things to be comfortable. And I just want to remind us, Crosspointe, our story, our collective story, is forward. The Christ that we follow says that every scripture, every instruction from God, every ounce of our faith ultimately boils down to love your neighbor as yourself. It all boils down to that. Love your neighbor as yourself. But here's the thing we have to keep in mind. Just think about the 10 Commandments again and how many countless specific questions those 10 Commandments raised about how to live them out. So you have 10 and then you boil it down to 1. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus boils it all down to 1. Love your neighbor as yourself. So friends, I don't know if you've thought about this before, but that requires a lot of interpretation among a community of people, because that's a ton of ambiguity. And again, you might not have realized this before, but that's really hard. And it can be really, really messy trying to figure out what that looks like in a never-ending list of unfolding moments and opportunities and situations where we have to wrestle with, what does love look like here, in this moment, in this time and place, in this context, with this person, with these people, here and now? What does love look like here? And yet, that's what the very Spirit of Christ is inviting us forward into. And absolutely, there's costs that come with that. Every time you venture into new territory, there are costs. There's no turn-by-turn GPS direction with every situation just laid out, detailing, okay, well, here's what love looks like in this situation and that situation and that situation. No, instead, we follow the ways and teachings of Jesus, the Spirit of Christ. And together, we do our best to follow and live that out in our world today, in our context, here and now, in this moment. And friends, in the midst of that moving forward, there's going to be people who will think that you've lost your mind and that we've lost our mind. There's going to be people that will bring harsh criticism towards you. And they're going to say things like, well, why don't you just why do you have to keep talking about all these political things? Can't you just let it go? Because they want to keep politics and faith completely separate all the time. They're going to say things like, well, why are you disrupting religious tradition? Why are you trying to elevate these voices and these perspectives? Let's just keep with what we have. Let's just keep with all the voices that we've always heard before. Why do we have to introduce new voices? Why do you have to rock the boat? Why are you not respecting the authority of the way my parents or grandparents or pastor interpreted this particular Bible verse for me? They told me this is some unshakable literal truth. So why are you not respecting its authority the way they told me to understand it? You know what? They'll say to us collectively, why don't you just sing the same songs the same way and teach the same way and function the same way the church always has? Even though the reality is the version of church that they understand really has only been around 50 to 100 years. But in their mind, this is the way the church has always done it. Because the tradition that they understand is you stay put. You go back to the way things were. And friends, we got to understand, we're going to be labeled. You'll be labeled. You'll be called names. We'll be called names. And some people will just want to go backwards to the way things used to be. And of course, that's really hard. Because often it's people that you love and care a lot about. There's always cost to moving forward. But let's not forget that there's also cost of refusing to move forward and just staying back where it's comfortable and secure. Because if we do that collectively, what will happen is we'll lose our passion and care for what we're doing and what we're living out in the world. We'll lose any sense of purpose. We'll lose our vitality, we'll lose our willingness to sacrifice for the greater good, and we'll lose our hope because we're no longer willing to actively participate in hope. To actively participate with Christ in the resurrection and the redemption of all things, and being a light to the entire world. That light will get snuffed out in us. And friends, deep down, we know that is a much greater cost, that we will lose our very selves if the decision is, you know what? Let's just keep going back to Egypt. Let's just go back to the way things were. Let's just be like all the other groups. Instead, personally, in our politics, and as a faith community, we're invited to follow the Spirit of Christ forward into the unknown. And yes, there will be new problems to tackle. And yes, there will be new challenges. And it will require us to listen to new voices and entertain new ideas. And yes, of course, it will be hard. Of course it will be. Because when you choose to follow the way of Christ and the Spirit of Christ and the way of love, it's just hard. Of course it is. But I'm convinced that's the best way to go. Now, as we wrap this up, one more quick signpost I want to offer you along the way, and it's this. Let's be people that practice self-care, self-compassion, and rest along the way. Friends, your willingness to rest can be an act of love even when it seems like storms are raging all around you. And let's not forget that the Jesus we follow took time to rest in a boat in the middle of a raging storm. And the reality is, in our world right now, many of us were hoping for a giant exhale after this crazy week. That one way or the other, it would just be over. But as of this morning, we find ourselves with a new president-elect and a current president who has made it clear that he intends to fight that result relentlessly in what will certainly be a continued season of intense stress and divide among people in our nation. And so I have no idea what all types of hard await us. But I'm not surprised that it's going to be hard, right? We have to remind ourselves, of course it's hard. Why would I expect it not to be hard? This is what moving forward looks like. And so I hope that one of the signposts along the way for all of us will be that we'll take moments to rest. We'll take moments to laugh, to share a good meal, and not feel guilty about it. That we'll take time to walk away from the news and social media for a bit, to play games, to be present with loved ones, even if it means it has to be via Zoom. And we won't feel bad about it. We won't feel like it's a sign that we don't care or that we're not engaged. A while back, the Wall Street Journal released an article that says in an average NFL football game, there's only 11 minutes of actual football played. 11 minutes. That the remaining 3 to 3.5 hours are in between plays, walking around, on the sidelines, conversations, rest. None of us would accuse the players in the middle of the action of being selfish for having periods of rest between plays. Right? Because that's how one actually makes it through the whole game. That's how one actually makes it through a whole season. How one actually makes it the long run of a whole career. And so, friends, understand this is a long road. And so give yourself some grace. Give yourself some rest. Give each other grace. Take moments to pause and to rest and to take care of yourself, because the way of love and the work that we are doing together as a community, the way of love and justice and belonging, it's hard. And the only way to do it well and to keep moving forward is when we follow what Jesus says is the foundation of everything. Love your neighbor as yourself. So friends, make sure to take time to love yourself so that we together can love our neighbors and our world shockingly well. Love you, friends. Take care.
Thank you for joining us today, and welcome home. If you are in need of assistance during this crisis, please reach out at crosspoint.org/help.